First lecture was about the strange beginnings of Song of Myself, somebody who had had no distinction whatsoever, not been to Harvard, not been to Yale, not been to college, period, who was a carpenter, a jack of all trades, suddenly reads Emerson and sees that there's, as it were, a want ad out there for the American poet who can sing the magnificence and also the detriments of this land, and he steps right up and he gets to work. He steps right up and he gets to work. We heard about how that happened, how he got going on Monday night, and what he did, one might say, is Walt Whitman discovered his soul. He discovered his soul. That is, he discovered this part of himself that is compassionate and loves other men and women, but is also proud. And the word proud has a special valence in Whitman. It means that if you're proud, you are never going to kneel to anybody, nor, significantly, are you ever going to be happy with anybody ever kneeling to you, right? In the second talk, we talked about the poem itself, and we talked about it as a quest romance, as it were, where Whitman, who for all purposes was the embodiment of democracy, had to deal with various major crises. And some of them that we looked at, Jesus, who is he? Violence, how do we deal with that? Death, how do we think about that? There are any number of others, but those are among those that we focused on. And he comes out at the end of the poem with a very potent program for democratic human life. Think of the grass, he would tell us, and turn away from the sun. If you're here on Wednesday night, you really do know what that means. The sun is Whitman's partial enemy. The sun is the sign of autocracy, sign of regalness, sign of kings. The grass is the sign of democracy. The grass is the sign of me and you and all the rest of us. So the question that I was left with, and the question that I left you with, was, would it ever be possible for a human being to do what it is Walt says we might do in order to live as thriving and contributing democratic people? It's such a tall order. Can you really imagine yourself as a leaf of grass? Can you really have the attitude to Jesus and to God and to death and to violence and to the sun that Walt indicates, right? Well, it seems to me that for all purposes, Walt, when he is in his, I guess he'd be about in his early 40s, is in a position where he has to prove himself as a democratic woman or a democratic man, right? So let's see what he's got, one might say. So we're going to move from poetry in the direction of experience. We're going to move from poetry in the direction of experiential life. Walt Whitman did all he could to advance the fortunes of the first edition of Leaves of Grass. He reviewed the book himself, not once, but 3 times. You're not supposed to review your own book. But Walt called him as he saw him. An American bard at last, he crowed. Whitman, the New Yorker, was commercially minded. Quickly, he got to work on a new edition. He wrote more poems and published them a year later in the 1856 printing of Leaves of Grass. This volume is short and squat, a quarto, not an expansive folio like the 55. It looks to be loaded with compact muscle. He printed on the side of the 1856 edition some quotation from the letter that he got from Ralph Waldo Emerson, recognizing him as the producer of the greatest piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet created. He did not ask Emerson's permission. Emerson was miffed. Whitman did not care. The 1855 volume didn't do what Whitman wanted. None of his volumes really did. He wanted his books to pass into the hands of the people. He wanted those he celebrated to read and to enjoy the celebration. That didn't happen in 1855 or 56 or 60 when the 3rd volume of Leaves came out. At the end of his life, at the close of a birthday celebration in Camden, New Jersey, that moved Walt to tears, he still mourned the fact that his work had never really reached his true audience. Maybe this is so because Whitman presents insurmountable conceptual difficulties, though perhaps it's that his vision, though cogent and readily comprehensible, remains so far out ahead of us. All through his life, though, Walt Whitman kept on trying. Not long after the 56 edition came out, Whitman moved back to Brooklyn with his mother and extended family, living in a basement apartment. The family had to rent out the top floor to keep themselves even marginally solvent. Whitman wrote poems and some journalistic pieces for a few dollars here and there. He still composed constantly. Walt was something of a graphomaniac. He turned almost every experience, sight, and sound into words, or at least he tried. The poet loved to watch, both in and out of the game, watching and wondering at it. But gradually, his studied and happy indolence turned into aimlessness. Loafing became lassitude. His interest in writing poems dwindled. Almost every day, Whitman traveled from Brooklyn, usually by ferry, to Manhattan. There he spent his time at a below-ground Broadway establishment called Pfaff's. The restaurant served as the meeting place for a group of American artists, actors, journalists, actresses, and writers who thought of themselves as bohemians. The man who brought the bohemian ethos over from Paris was a Nantucket-born and raised writer and editor named Henry Knapp. Knapp had been to Paris and taken in the style of the left bank, where he had resided for a couple of years, acquiring a French mistress and learning to live the sensuous, indolent life of French cafe and theater. Knapp was the main figure at the long table under Broadway, where the bohemians gathered. That space is still there on Broadway today. It now stores women's shoes. Pfaff, the proprietor, was German, rotund, gregarious, and hospitable. He seemed to have loved filling his restaurant with the fast and slightly scandalous figures who came to sit with Knapp, shoot the breeze, stage duels of wit, and plan great futures for themselves. Among the wits, Knapp was preeminent. Of his rival editor Horace Greeley, my ancestor, as I was told as a boy, Knapp said, "He's a self-made man who worships his creator." Women? Takes a while, but it gets there. Women as well as men sat at the long table. There was Ada Clare, the novelist, and Ada Beckham, the most notorious actress of the day, who rode on stage wearing a nude body stocking in a play based on Byron's Beppo. Whitman sat at the long table too, though there was little of the wit about him. He was prone to quiet conversation with the bohemians sitting closest, but more than that, he was inclined to listen. Whitman was as devoted a listener as he was an observer. Everyone who knew him at Pfaff's seemed to have liked him. This is especially true of the prime bohemian Knapp himself. Knapp was an early champion of Whitman's work and never lost admiration for the poet or his willingness to help publicize him. Whitman drank at Pfaff's, but not very much. Seems a beer would last him through the night. He occasionally had a glass of champagne, but his relative silence didn't stop him from becoming a figure there. He was known as the author of a scandalous volume, the erotic side of Whitman's poetry had been excoriated in a dozen ways by at least a dozen reviewers. He also dressed the part of the avant-garde poet. Slouch hat, open shirt, pants tucked into high boots. His beard was going richly aflower. He looked like someone to reckon with, which in his way he was. But Whitman didn't spend all his time at Pfaff sitting at the long table and listening to the wits vie with each other for Knapp's approval. There was another table closer to the center of the tavern that Whitman also favored. This one was populated by young men, whose company Whitman apparently relished as much as he did that of the wits at the long table. Was it a gay culture that Whitman was involved in? It's not certain. For some time, Whitman had been drawn to the company of males, most usually young working-class men. He listed their names in his journal, walked with them, talked with them, hugged and kissed them, and occasionally slept with them. Was there sex involved? None of Whitman's behavior was unusual for mid-19th century America, where same-sex friendships were cultivated by men and women alike. Many women approached Walt with romance in their mind, but he fended them off, usually with some charm. But he pursued intimate relations with men quite frequently. Were they ever consummated? We do not know for certain. Of Whitman's most prominent critics, Richard Poirier seems most certain that Whitman led a thriving sexual life. Small instance of repression there. David Reynolds, the author of a comprehensive volume on Whitman and his cultural milieu, is far less certain. On the matter of Whitman and gay sex, he's an agnostic, as am I. For our story, the story of Walt Whitman, the hospital visitor, one fact about Whitman's relations with young men matters above the rest. Many of the men Whitman befriended during his days at Pfaff's were stage drivers. They drove horse-drawn wagons ferrying passengers and freight up and down Broadway. Broadway could be chaotic. Few real traffic regulations, little enforcement of those that existed, busy people hustling in every single direction. Accidents were common, fights between the drivers anything but rare. Many drivers got hurt, some of them badly. Whitman, who often rode up on the box with the drivers as they banged their way down Broadway, was a loyal friend to them all. When they were injured, he visited them in the hospital. He sat by their bedsides, talked with them, joked, offered them tobacco and other little gifts. He also did one of the things that he did best. He listened. Whitman could sit by the hour at a driver's bed, learning about who he was, where he came from, what his dreams were, and what his problems. The drivers liked and respected Walt, and in the hospital, his connection with them deepened. There was a forced, nearly hysterical quality about the revelry at Pfaff's during the late 1850s. America was moving closer to war. Many of the regulars pretended to ignore the coming cataclysm, But not Walt. He worried for his nation. He had appointed himself its personal bard, and he believed that the welfare of any nation, but especially a democracy, was much in the hands of its poets. Whitman was furiously committed to the idea of union. The United States must stay one and whole. If it did not, the democratic ideal might be dismissed as a failure. Whitman did all he could in his poems and journalism to fight for national unity. In this, he was much like Lincoln. He disliked slavery, but the prospect of disunion was his principal anxiety. Lincoln said that if he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would gladly do so. Whitman, the citizen and journalist, would have concurred, though, as we can see in the poem, Whitman the visionary nurtured other aspirations about race and equality. America was moving toward crisis, and the denizens of Fafs, Whitman included, were dealing with it in their different ways. Whitman wrote and brooded and wrote and braced himself for the moment when his beloved Union would undergo challenge. Whitman saw Lincoln for the first time on Tuesday, February 19, 1861, when the president came to New York on the way to Washington for his inauguration. A crowd of 30,000 gathered on Broadway getting a look at this president-elect. Whitman saw Lincoln leave his carriage, mount the steps of the Astor Hotel, turn, take a slow, Lincoln-esque, melancholy look around him, then disappear behind closed doors. Lincoln did not speak a word to the crowds who gathered to see him, or so Whitman says. Others say he made brief remarks. Whitman was atop a stagecoach when he saw Lincoln, the man who would fascinate and move him for the next 4 years and beyond. A handful of states had already left the Union on the day that Whitman watched Lincoln arrive in New York, and before long Southern troops fired on Fort Sumter. War was on. The next 2 years were among the worst of Walt's life. He was too old to fight. He was now in his 40s, and all the beefsteak, champagne, and butter he had consumed at Faf's had made him portly. Whitman had been terrified by the idea of civil war. He hated the thought of the states being at deadly odds with each other. The states being in tension with one another was fine with Walt. He wanted as much diversity and even opposition as possible without complete fraction. Once war came, Whitman became a fierce proponent of Northern victory. Lincoln called for mass enlistment, and Whitman actually wrote a poem, not one of his best, I'm sorry to say, seconding the call. Whitman continued to write poetry and some journalism from the start of the war through to 1862. But these were among Walt's worst days. He simply did not know what to do with himself. What should the bard of America do when his nation was split and his citizens were off trying to kill one another? Whitman rambled and wrote a little, wrote some and rambled, but he was living with no real sense of purpose. The casualty reports rolled in, and what had seemed like it would be a short war went on and on. The new recruits who marched out of New York City to fight the Rebs left with ropes tied around the barrels of their rifle, each planning to drag a Confederate recruit back home with him. Matters, of course, didn't go that way. The soldiers who enlisted on the Union side generally couldn't imagine the war would last 4 months. It would go on for 4 years. But in time, through a complex sequence of events, Walt found himself in Washington, D.C. That began when his brother George was reported, it was a little bit fuzzy, reported as wounded in the newspaper, and Walt immediately went off to find him. Walt found George, who seemed to have not 9 lives, but about 27 lives. Everybody in his regiment was wounded or killed at one time or another, but George just kept on going. He started out as a private. He left the war as a colonel, highly decorated and much beloved, and also much admired for his ability never to be seriously hurt. He had gotten a scrape there at the Battle of Fredericksburg, and when Walt found him, he was absolutely thrilled to see him, right? Because he was very close to his family. He adored every last one of them, from the most difficult to the most affable, and George was among the most affable. George and Jeff were the ones that he got along with the most easily. But he saw something really striking when he went to the battlefront. He saw the tents of the surgeons, and he saw something that stayed with him his whole life, a mountain of arms and legs, severed arms and legs, in a pile not far from the hospital. And he was just blown over by it. And he couldn't resist. He went into the hospital tents, and he started to help. He was clumsy at the beginning. He was inept at the beginning, but he did his very best. He had the good fortune to encounter a nurse named Clara Barton there, and Clara Barton was an ideal to Walt in that she was a ferociously effective nurse, and he admired her greatly. Walt himself was not a skilled nurse. He did not know medicine at all, but if he could have learned it, he would have liked to be what Clara Barton was. As it was, he turned into something else, as we'll see. But the whole situation just moved him tremendously. He was overwhelmed by that pile of arms and legs, as who would not be? But who among us would not, rather than using it as a trigger for more action, take off and get away from that scene as quickly as possible? I would be terrified. to see that. I do not know what I would do, but it is actually quite an astonishing moment, right? In Washington, he attended on what he called the Great Army of the Sick. It's now that Whitman becomes more than the poet of Song of Myself. Now he may become the manifestation of his poetic vision. To complete the work of Song of Myself, Walt left the everyday world and entered into a genuinely hellish zone. Everywhere around him were men in torment, soldiers, wounded, sick, and dying. They'd been brought by trainloads and boatloads from the battlefields of Virginia and elsewhere to the capital of the Union to be cared for, as well as resources from the state of medical knowledge at the time allowed. Some would recover and rejoin their regiments. Some would go home, often without an arm or a leg, or as victims of double amputation. Many would die there in Washington. They died away from their friends in the regiment, away from their friends at home, separated by miles from their families who often did not know where they were. Many of them died alone, and a number more would have died alone if they had not been visited and attended by a shambling, kindly old man. To the man, Walt in his 40s seemed quite old, who was also the greatest American poet who has ever lived. As Roy Morris Jr., the author of The Better Angel, a beautiful and perceptive book about Whitman's life during the Civil War, puts it, at the time of Whitman's arrival in the capital, those who languished in the whitewashed wooden sheds, the wounded, converted government building, and outlying tent hospitals were, practically speaking, the sickest and most gravely wounded of all. By the time they had made their way to Washington, the soldiers had already endured the disease-ridden squalor of camp life, the exhaustions of marching, the terrors of combat, the chills of fever, the hammering of bullets, the slicing of canister, and the dull grinding rasp of the surgeon's saw. In many ways, their greatest trial still lay ahead. Before they could return to their regiments, or better yet, walk through the gates of their peacetime homes, honorably discharged from the army, with an empty sleeve or a brace of crutches, they first had to survive the hospitals. The men that Whitman began to visit when he arrived in Washington were not only wounded, but they were sick. Many of them were wasting away from chronic illnesses. Diarrhea hit half the Union troops and almost every one of the Confederates, eventually killing over 100,000 soldiers. They died protracted, painful, and humiliating deaths. Whitman was there to comfort as many of them as he could. In the final days of 1862, when Whitman arrived in Washington, there were about 35 hospitals in and around the capital, with about 13,000 soldiers present. The conditions were almost astonishingly bad. Doctors had no idea at the time that diseases were transported by germs, so no one took care to keep the facilities particularly clean. One of the hospitals was located on a site that had been used to quarter horses. The germs from their manure quickly permeated the place, and men grew sick and died from them. In time, Whitman learned to face the noise and the stench and the suffering. And this is Whitman in one of his letters to Emerson. The first shudder has long passed over, he wrote to Emerson, after the initial couple of weeks had gone by. To his brother Jeff, Walt wrote, I never before had my feelings so thoroughly and so permanently absorbed to the very roots as by these huge swarms of dear, wounded, sick, dying boys. I get very much attached to some of them, and many of them have come to depend on seeing me and having me sit by them a few minutes, as if for their lives. Walt brought gifts. He came to the hospital almost daily with candy, chewing gum, tobacco, wine, brandy, shirts, and socks. He delivered ice cream for a group of men from the Midwest who had never tasted the wonderful concoction. He also brought the men letter-writing supplies, pens and paper. If a man didn't know how to write, Whitman took dictation. If he was too injured to pick up a pencil, Whitman picked it up for him. Because of Whitman, many families were delivered from anguish, learning that their boys were still alive. He did the soldiers' bidding as well as he could. A German boy dying asked for a German Lutheran clergyman. Whitman went out through the streets of Washington, and he found one. A young man named Henry Boardman was sick of hospital food. What would you like? Walt asked. Rice pudding. Whitman had some made for him. When the soldiers died, Whitman frequently wrote to their parents, often letters of surpassing tenderness. Here's one of them. I write you this letter because I would do something at least in his memory. His fate was a hard one to die so. He's one of the thousands of our unknown American men in the ranks, about whom there is no record or fame, no fuss made about their dying unknown. But I find in them the real precious and royal ones of this land, giving themselves up, aye, even their young and precious lives, in their country's cause. Whitman chronicled his time in the hospitals in a remarkable series of letters, many of them written to his mother Louisa. A few were to Ralph Waldo Emerson, his teacher, and now in a certain sense his student too. Walt wrote this one when he first came to the hospitals. I desire and intend to write a little book out of this phase of America, her masculine young manhood, its conduct under most trying of and highest of all exigencies, which she, as by lifting a corner and a curtain, has vouchsafed me to see. America, already brought to hospital in her fair youth, brought and deposited here in this great white sepulchre of Washington itself. Along with the soldiers that came to Washington, a wave of office seekers, profiteers, and all-around hustlers. And this is Walt, well-dressed, rotten, meager, nimble, and impotent, full of gab. To Walt, they made a potent contrast to the soldiers. This other freight of helpless, worn, and wounded youth, genuine of the soil, Whitman says, of darlings and true heirs to me, the first unquestioned and convincing Western crop, prophetic of the future, proofs undeniable to all men's ken of perfect beauty, tenderness, and pluck that never a race yet rivaled. Whitman did not care at all for the creatures he called the big bugs who descended on Washington for gain. But from the start he adored the soldiers for their valor, simplicity, and their stoicism. What Whitman faced when he entered the hospitals was daunting by anyone's measure. The letter to Emerson continues, here in the barracks they lie, in those boarded Washington hospital barracks, whitewashed outside and in, 1 story high enough, airy and clean enough, one of the wards, for a sample, a long stretch 160 feet long, with aisle down the middle, with cots 50 or more on each side, and then this striking formulation, and death there, up and down the aisle, tapping lightly by night or day, here and there some poor young man with relieving touch. This is one ward. A cluster of 10 or 12 make a current Washington hospital, where in this moment lie languishing, burning with fever or down with diarrhea, the imperial blood and rarest marrow of the North. Here, at any rate, as I go for a couple of hours daily and get to be welcomed and useful, I find the masses fully justified by closest contact, never vulgar, ever calm, without greediness, no flummery, no frivolity, responding electric and without fail to affection, yet no whining. Not the first unmanly whisper have I seen or heard. These were the kinds of Americans that Whitman had dreamed of in Song of Myself, proud and self-reliant, a people he believed like none other in the world. He was not surprised that many of the best of them were from the West, where he felt America was rejuvenating itself, overcoming the corruption of the East. To him, these men had done what he had hoped America would finally come to do, eclipse the heroes of the antique world. They were not the product of Homer and Virgil, but of the Declaration and the Constitution. Not long after his arrival in the hospitals, Whitman wrote, got very much interested in some particular cases in hospitals here. Go now steadily to more or less of said hospitals by day and by night. Find always the sick and dying soldiers forthwith begin to cling to me in a way that makes a fellow feel funny enough. These hospitals, so different from all others, these thousands and tens and 20s of thousands of American young men badly wounded, all sorts of wounds, operated on, pallid with diarrhea, languishing, dying with fever and pneumonia, and open a new world somehow to me, giving closer insight, new things, exploring deeper minds than any yet, showing our humanity. Whitman, you hear, wasn't only finding American heroes to challenge the heroes of old, antique, feudal civilizations. We know the resonance the word feudal has for Walt. He was also discovering new powers in himself. It seems he could do in life what he imagined in his poetry. He could enter the lives of the wounded men who surrounded him. He says, they open a new world somehow to me, giving closer insights, new things, exploring deeper minds than any. But he had seen a preview of that new world in his vision. Whitman came in time to believe that he was a healing presence. He was a salutary influence on the soldiers. I adapt myself to each case, he writes. Some need to be humored. Some are rather out of their head. Some merely want me to sit down near them and hold them by the hand. One will want a letter written to mother or father. Yesterday I wrote over 12 letters. Some like to have me feed them, wounded perhaps in shoulder or wrist, perhaps a few bites of my peaches. Some want a cooling drink. I have some very nice syrups from raspberries, etc. Others want writing paper, envelopes and stamps, etc. I could fill a sheet with one day's items. I often go just at dark, sometimes stay till nearly all night. I like to go just before supper, carrying a pot or jar of something good, and go around with a spoon distributing a little here and there. But he contributed more than practical assistance. After all this succoring of the stomach, which is of course most welcome and indispensable, he says, I should say that I believe my profoundest help to these sick and dying men is probably the soothing vigoration I steadily bear in mind. to infuse in them through affection, cheering love, and the like between them and me. It has saved more than one life. There's a strange influence here. I have formed attachments here in the hospital that I shall keep to my dying day, and they will the same, without doubt. And they did. After the war, these men in great numbers wrote to Walt, thanking him for what they had done for him when they were in hospital. They named their children after him. They spoke about him all through their lives. And the letters that they wrote, some of them men are not literate, some are superbly literate, and the ones that are less literate will simply break your heart. They just adored what he did for them. Whitman quickly became a familiar, accepted figure in the hospitals. Everyone seemed to know him and let him make his way through the worst of the suffering. "Oh, Mother," he says, "there seems to me as I go through these rows of cots as if it was too bad to accept these children, to subject them to such premature experiences. I devote myself to Armory Square Hospital because it contains by far the worst cases, most repulsive wounds, has the most suffering and most need of consolation. I go every day without fail, and often at night. Sometimes stay very late. No one interferes with me, guards, doctors, nurses, nor anyone. I am left to take my own course. They are only children, these ferocious warriors, and Walt treats them with the dignity best accorded to brave men and the tenderness that all children deserve, but in time of war rarely find." Day after day he continued on, doing small acts of kindness that meant worlds to the men. To a friend, probably James Redpath, he wrote, "I've been most of this day in Armory Square Hospital, 7th Street. I seldom miss a day or evening. Out of the 600 or 700 in this hospital, I try to give a word or trifle to everyone without exception, making regular rounds among them. I give all kinds of sustenance, blackberries, peaches, lemons, and sugars, wines, all kinds of preserves, pickles, brandy, milk, shirts, and all articles of underclothing, tobacco, tea, handkerchief, etc., etc., etc. I always give paper, envelope, stamps. I want a supply for this purpose. 600 or 700 men in a day and evening. The degree of human and humane energy Walt had needed for so many exchanges overwhelms the imagination." Whitman found that many of these men were broke. Their salaries, such as they might have been, never reached them. He saw how humiliating it was to be lying ill and wounded without a cent. He gave them his own money and did what he could to raise money from others. This is Walt now. "To many I give what I have, small sums of money. Half of the soldiers in the hospital have not a cent. There are many returned prisoners, sick, lost, and all, and every day squads of men from the front, cavalry or infantry, brought in wounded or sick, generally without a cent of money." It didn't bother Walt to pass out almost everything he had. He'd been born poor and was certain he'd be poor all his life. Poverty was probably his preferred condition. Money might tempt him to stand above other men or women. Walt had a word and a small gift from most everyone in the hospital, but he was particularly drawn to the worst casualties. His ability to face such suffering is remarkable, until we remember that in his poetic vision he had seen so much misery as well as joy. "I passed death with the dying and birth with the new-washed babe," he'd said. And there in the hospitals he saw his share of death. He continued, "I am not contained between my hat and my boots." That is, his presence was mystical, imaginative, and empathic, as well as physical. He connected with them soul to soul. This is Walt again. "I select the most needy cases and devote my time and service as much to them. I find it tells best. Some are mere lads, 17, 18, 19, or 20. Some are silent, sick, heavy-hearted. Things, attention, etc. are very rude in the army hospitals. Nothing but the mere hard routine, no time for tenderness or extras. So I go round. Some of my boys die. Some get well. Some died, some got well. And Walt was there beside them doing what he could do. Whitman had something for everybody. He notes more than once that he did what he could for the black troops and for the Confederate troops as well. He was there for everybody." Is it possible that Walt had seen it before, been there before? It seems that his poetic vision had readied him for the hospitals. This is from Song of Myself. "To anyone dying, thither I speed and twist the knob of the door. Turn the bedclothes to the foot of the bed. Let the physician and the priest go home. I seize the descending man. I raise him with resistless will. Oh, despair, here's my neck. By God, you shall not go down. Hang your whole weight upon me. I dilate you with tremendous breath. I bore you up. Every room in the house do I fill with an armed force, lovers of me, bafflers of graves. Sleep, and they keep guard all night. No doubt, not to cease, not doubt, nor to cease, shall dare to lay a finger upon you. I have embraced you, and henceforth possess you to myself. And when you rise in the morning, you will find that what I tell you is true." The vision here is intense and rather hyperbolic, somewhat exaggerated. Whitman puts on supernatural powers of comfort and healing. Whatever grandiosity Walt the man may have felt on this score in 1854 and 5, the actual experience of the hospital seems to have changed him. His work there was patient, incremental, steady, kind, and sometimes inflected with humane resignation. But that does not mean he didn't save some lives, baffle a grave or two, at least for a while. Sometimes when one of the soldiers died, Walt wrote to his parents and let them know about his last hours. These were not easy letters to write, but how much they must have meant to the families of the young men. Remember this, the greatest and most original writer that America has produced spent time writing letters in behalf of young men to their grieving parents. If in all of literary history there is an example of comparable largesse of spirit, I do not know where it is to be found. Here is part of one sent to the parents of one Erastus Haskell. Many nights, says Walt, I sat in the hospital by his bedside till far in the night. The lights would be put out, yet I would sit there silently, hours, late, perhaps fanning him. He always liked to have me sit there, but never cared to talk. I shall never forget those nights. It was curious and solemn scene, the sick and wounded lying around in the cots, just visible in the darkness, and this dear man at hand lying on what proved to be his deathbed. I do not know his past life, but what I do know and what I saw of him, he was a noble boy. I felt he was one I should get very much attached to. I think you have reason to be proud of such a son, and all his relatives have cause to treasure his memory. Whitman wants Erastus's parents to remember his last hours. He wants to be precise and detailed about their dear young son. Walt maintained his integrity in the letters he wrote to the soldiers' parents. He did not talk about God or the afterlife, though he was willing to declare that we could not know the future of our departed ones. When one of the wounded or dying men spoke to Walt about faith in Jesus and the Lord, Walt treated the man with kind respect, but never falsely joined him in his convictions. Walt let the men know that he was glad for their faith, and that was all. In Specimen Days, he recalls how a soldier named Oscar F. Wilbur of the 154th New York Regiment asked him to read to him from the Bible. Walt could see that Oscar was dying, and he read to him about the last hours of Christ and the crucifixion, which brought the young man to tears. He asked me, Walt said, if I enjoyed religion. Walt responded, perhaps not, my dear, in the way you mean, and yet maybe it is the same thing. Perhaps the most charming of all Walt's gestures was going out to get ice cream and distributing it to men who had never had it before. Oh, I must tell you, he wrote to his mother, Louisa, I gave the boys in Carver Hospital a great treat of ice cream a couple of days ago. Went round myself through about 15 large wards. I brought some 10 gallons. Very nice. You would have cried and been amused, too. Many of the men had to be fed. Several of them I saw cannot probably live, yet they quite enjoyed it. I gave everybody some. Quite a number of Western boys had never tasted ice cream before. They relished such things, oranges and lemons, too. But the darkness was always close. Walt never denied or tried to evade it. Mother, I feel a little blue this morning, as 2 young men I knew very well have just died. One died last night, and the other about half an hour before I went to the hospital. I did not anticipate the death of either of them. Each was a very, very sad case, so young. Well, Mother, I have written you another gloomy sort of letter. I do not feel as first-rate as usual. Now the hospitals are beginning to wear on Walt. He had always been proud of his great good health, but it was just beginning to fail. And as the years went by in the hospital, his health was more and more compromised. He probably suffered a mild stroke or two, and he was never the same in terms of his physical health for the rest of his life. He was one of the many casualties in that regard of the Civil War. In Washington at the hospitals, in my opinion, Whitman effectively completed the poem called Song of Myself. He became a version of the person that his poem prophesied. He engaged his soul, clear and sweet as he called it. His spirit became his mode of connection with the sick, wounded, and dying men. His imagination allowed him to see who they were, what they were feeling, and how he might be able to help them. All of his imaginative merges in the poem. The one with the fireman, the hounded slave, the old artillerist, Jesus himself on the cross, were rehearsals for the way he entered into the hearts of the wounded young men. The tender figure that Walt brought forth at the start of the poem, compassionating, idle, and unitary, was in a sense there, in the hospitals, looking on with its side-curved head, sympathizing with all it perceived. Walt's soul loved beyond measure in those hospitals. But when he was in the hospitals, he was also Walt Whitman, one of the roughs, his practical self. He was tough. Whitman's endurance during the hospital years was astounding. He worked hour past hour, day after day, in a hellish environment, doing all he could. His health was constantly in jeopardy, but somehow he held up for more than 2 years. In the hospitals, Whitman proved to be durable and strong. He truly possessed what Emerson said he did, buffalo strength, one of the greatest phrases that's ever been written about Walt Whitman. It comes from Emerson. A man, he said it to Carlyle, like the poetry or not, the man has buffalo strength. He showed that when a person allows himself full access to his vulnerable soul, he doesn't have to become weak and easily discouraged. In the hospitals, Walt was still that formidable man at the beginning of Song of Myself. Yet he was more than that, too. By and large, he didn't bring God into the hospitals with him. Preachers of all stripes made their way into the wards, bent on shoring up the men's faith or converting them. Whitman did no such thing. The soldiers knew and loved him as the old man who did not preach to them. He may have gone on beholding God in every object, but he did not surrender the idea that he, and all others in the democracy, were as marvelous as God could be, and perhaps more so. Walt did not despise religion or priests, but he understood that the priests and religions were nothing more than a prelude. They helped make possible what we would have here in America, the spiritualization of democracy. Some of their work was to be applauded, hurrah for them, but now they were outmoded and needed to be put in binders and placed on the shelf. A new age was at hand, one in which we could see with Walt's help that all of what was best in religion had simply led up to the spiritual democracy that was now coming into being. When Walt was in the hospitals, he kept moving, man to man, bed to bed, ward to ward, hospital to hospital. His poets had showed him what it was like to stay in motion, giving all the love he could muster to this one and that, then moving on before he got caught or encumbered. He included everyone in his hospital administrations, as Song promised that he would. Union soldiers and Confederates, black and white, young and middle-aged. If you're in the hospital, Walt Whitman was there to help you. Walt was friendly to everyone and took people on equal terms. Remember, he did not want to be extraordinary. He was one of the mass, one of the group. His job was poet. Yours might be blacksmith, tinker, or weaver. You all did your best with pride. No one was better than anybody else. If you told Walt that he was extraordinary, wonderful, grand, he might well have been offended. He was one of the crowd, a citizen in the great experiment. In the hospitals, Walt was able to look straight at death. He could do this in a way that almost no one who is not a doctor or nurse can do. But his vision had prepared him for it. To die is different from what anyone imagines and luckier, he said. Whitman knew he was a blade of grass, and that he would be reincarnated as fresh grass, new citizens of the democracy, as fresh grass, new citizens of the democracy arose in the world. The smallest sprout shows, he told us, that there really is no death. He must have believed this. It had been revealed to him in his vision. If not, he couldn't have faced death, both his own death, he risked his life every day in those hospitals, and the deaths of so many soldiers with as much equanimity as he did. Then he came back the next day, and the next day, to give more help. Whitman didn't do his good deeds under anyone's direction but his own. He didn't care for bosses or ward overseers. No sons or aspiring sons for him. If you're here for lecture 2, you know all the resonance that the son has. For a while he was associated with relief agencies, but their members did not care for him, nor he for them. Quietly and modestly, he went about his business, putting into practice what he had learned from the amazing spiritual voyage that he had undertaken. In his vision, Whitman had seen war. He'd been in an old-time sea fight, and, present at, you'll remember this, a jet-black sunrise. He wasn't afraid of war, and he knew it to be necessary for sustaining democracy. He didn't pull back or turn away. He understood that battle was part of human life. He risked his life in the hospitals day to day, almost as much as the soldiers did at the front. I like to think, just about done, I like to think that the author of Leaves of Grass is the man who let his poem teach him how to live and what to do. The voyage he went on taught him to walk away from ambition and striving. It brought him into the hospitals, where he humbled himself in a way that few people can. He became a servant. We might say he became a servant to democracy, clear and sweet and kind. Whitman's poem in The Life in the Hospital set a standard for democratic thought and action, a high standard. Surely few of us could ever follow it fully. I surely could not. And Walt did not always live up to it either, through the poems or in his life. But I think he points us in the right direction, toward a genuine form of democratic flourishing. The author of Leaves of Grass, it's the old man with the spuming beard fanning the dying boy over there. It's the one writing that armless young man's letters home. He's there, over there, laughing with the nurse, teasing the doctor, trying to draw a little more attention to the boy in the corner stricken with typhus. He's just come onto the ward laughing with vats of ice cream in his hand. There he is. He's the one who wrote Song of Myself. And then, he's the one the great poem brought into being. He's up ahead waiting for us. Thank you. Okay, so I'll be happy to answer questions if you have them, or respond to anything you might want to say. Yes?
Beautiful lecture.
Thank you.
And my question is really between art and life, which you brought up. It seems to me we probably benefit the most from his poetry because he calls us to the spirit world.
Mm-hmm.
However, he seemed to feel that the spirit world needed to be instantiated in life itself, in the physical world. And he lived through that.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, like, how are we to feel in the cloistered world of academia where we only eat half the calling?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, are we to feel guilty about living in this cloistered world and not actually instantiating it in the physical world?
Uh-huh. I think that if I could answer for Walt, Walt hated people to feel guilty. He never wanted anybody to feel guilty, right? I think that he pursued his own destiny. He learned how to live his life from the vision that he had, and he did his best to do so. But he's not asking us to achieve that amazing level of selflessness, you know? But he does lay out a map to what seems to me the very highest degree of fulfillment, of Song of Myself. I think that Walt would smile down from wherever he may be, and I assume it is on high somewhere. He would smile down if we became a little friendlier, a little less plugged into status, a little less interested in authority, a little less mesmerized by the sun. You know, I think that would be enough. You know, because he wanted those two things: compassion on the one hand, right? And compassion can be just everyday friendliness, ease, generosity, but it could be what he did in the hospitals. And then he wanted pride in his own particular sense, never bowing, never kneeling to anything. And if we tried to follow those very simple rubrics, I think he would be quite pleased. And you know, guilt is just not. If Walt Whitman thought he was making anybody guilty, he would be so sad. He would embrace you and tell you shouldn't feel guilty at all. I think also that I should add that what he did in the hospitals was a way of answering a question that he does pose at the end of Song of Myself, which is, am I, Walt Whitman, the greatest poet who has ever lived and the greatest American who has ever lived? Because you kind of get that feeling at the end. And I think what he did was, in a way, to merge with his own humility and show that it was no big deal to be a great poet, and no better, in a certain sense, than to be a great craftsman or a good devoted craftsman. That's what he wanted to show, it seems to me. And the great thing about it, I think, is that he learned a good deal of his humility, or he was brought up in his humility by observing Lincoln, whom he was absolutely fascinated by, and whom he found the most capable, strong, resilient, and also tender, humble, funny, self-aware of individuals, right? So that there is a point, there is a place, it seems to me, in democracy for a kind of greatness, but that greatness has got to avail of itself of humility, and Walt sure did that in those years. And Lincoln did it all through his presidency, or he did his very, very best. You know? Yeah, please.
I'm curious to know, firstly, thank you for your lecture. I love this reading of Song of Myself as a promissory note to the later Whitman.
Uh-huh.
How do you, even in an abstract way, relate the hospital years to drum taps?
Mm-hmm.
Which emerges, it seems,
Yeah.
not directly out of them, but it's
Right.
1865.
What I try to do in writing about Whitman is find him at his best. Do you know what I mean? And put forward the vision that emerges from him at his best. I'm not a great fan of drum taps. Don't know why. To me, you know, the poetry lights up in 55 and kind of dwindles a little bit. Then it flares up again in 65 when Lincoln dies. Then it dwindles for a long time, about 25 years. So that I don't, in my book, try to find a comprehensive picture of Whitman, and I don't also try to make a judgment on him as an individual or a poet writ large. I try not to deal with what he is, but what he gives us and the opportunities that he opens up for us. And it seems to me those opportunities are most available in Song of Myself and in the hospital work and in a few other poems. You know, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, I get the same kind of a jolt from that I do from Song of Myself. But he rode high only a very few times. And the rest of the time, you know, the old New York journalist kicks back in and gives us some of the flatlands. But when he rode high, there's never been anything like it, you know? People, poets all over the world, they read Song of Myself, they read The First Leaves of Grass, everywhere, everywhere. Latin America, Africa, Asia, the Soviet Union, Russia in particular. They read it and they're galvanized by it. He influences poets everywhere, absolutely everywhere. It's miraculous. It's an amazing thing. Anybody else? Yes, please.
Actually, I have two questions. The first one, do you think Lincoln and Whitman ever met in person? Because I read somewhere that they nodded at each other as they passed each other, but they didn't,
Yes.
and acknowledged the respect. But I wondered if you...
There was a lot of nodding, but I think it's pretty mythical. Walt wrote a lot about seeing Lincoln riding through town. Walt was an early riser and an early morning walker through the city. And he would occasionally see Lincoln taking a walk on his own with his bodyguard or with a small troop, riding with a small troop of cavalry. And Whitman does occasionally say that they would nod to each other. Now, there is reason to think that Lincoln would have known who Whitman was. Supposedly when he was a young lawyer in Illinois, somebody brought Leaves of Grass into the office, and Lincoln would sit there reading it aloud to the other clerks with delight and chuckles, and he found it extremely illuminating in many ways. Supposedly he brought it home once for the weekend, and he said, when he came back, he said, "We are lucky still to have this volume, for Mother nearly consigned it to the flames." That is, Mary Todd Lincoln had heard about the scandalous poet named Walt, and she had very nearly burnt the, because books were very expensive, very dear at the time. And so there's that. Whitman supposedly was in one room away from Lincoln once, but they didn't quite meet. It never really quite happened. But there's surely a big spiritual conjunction on Whitman's part, right? And it may really be that Lincoln found something in Song of Myself that motivated his astonishing eloquence. It's not entirely unlike Whitman's, So the relationship is there. Relationship is there, and I think Whitman probably believed on some level that Lincoln was nodding to a person that he knew. He understood that Whitman was the author of Leaves of Grass. We just don't know about that. But the fascinating thing is how Whitman tried to deal with his deep affection for Lincoln and his astonishing respect for Lincoln, despite the fact that Whitman was really skeptical about the people he called the big bugs, bosses, authority figures, and he's working on that all the time. You have another question? That was great.
my second one.
Yes.
I just love when I heard the learned astronomer.
Yes.
So how do you describe, does that reflect his personality, his philosophy?
Sure. I mean, I don't have the learned astronomer memorized, but Whitman goes to, it's a very short poem, Whitman goes to a talk by a learned astronomer, and he learns all about astronomy and astrophysics of the day and whatever it is.
Diagrams.
Yes, charts and diagrams. And then he walks out and he looks with great bliss upon the stars. And that's just part of, it's part of Whitman's skepticism about school teachers, scientists, lawyers, doctors, the whole professional bit. He really doesn't want to see excessive intellection destroy anybody's love for the natural world, and he feels that that's a possibility. So it's a very representative poem. It's a beautiful one. It's very short, and just about everybody who likes Whitman likes that poem.
And I love his mystical, moist night air.
Yes.
That he describes.
Yeah, you got to bust loose from too much college. I think he'd be glad to be being talked about here, but he'd be a little worried. This is a university, is it really? All right. And he never had anything to do with universities. Never had anything to do with the other major literary figures in the time. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a Harvard graduate. He came from not a moneyed family, but a very influential family. He's one of the best educated people that you can imagine. Emily Dickinson only spent 1 year at Mount Holyoke. I think it was wasn't called a college then. Anyway, she spent 1 year at Mount Holyoke. But Emily Dickinson's mind was so strong that she could drink up all of culture in about an hour and a half. And then she came back and lived with her father and the family in an extremely literate and literary household with a spectacular library that she used quite freely. Where did Whitman come from? Who knows, From traipsing around the streets of New York, reading the newspapers, and having a vision, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, please.
Do you know if Whitman ever interacted directly with Clara Barton, the founder of the Red Cross, during the Civil War?
Yeah, I think we talked about this before you came in.
Was that?
May have spoken about this before you came in.
Oh.
He was on the battlefield at Fredericksburg, where Clara Barton was doing her work, and he was just wrapped in admiration for her, and she was part of the inspiration for Walt, I think, going to the hospitals.
Since he spoke to her.
No, I think he just observed her. She was so formidable that she was very difficult of approach. Yeah, I mean, she's just constantly going. But he may have. I mean, Whitman would talk to anybody. You know, he loved to talk, loved to listen, and he always had time. You know, the greatest literary man in a certain way, literary person we've ever had. He's always got time for anybody. Oh yeah, sure. You know, patient, kind. You know, he had his flaws, I suppose, but highly decent, more than decent, kind of saintly person for a little while. Anybody else? I know it's Friday night. Time to rock and roll. Yes.
As a romanticist, Walt Whitman, was he very against like the Union and the Confederacy like splitting because like he wanted one like people of like different opinions like to coexist with one another?
Yes.
Why was like democracy his like preferred choice of government over all other different types?
I think that he saw that democracy was where people could flourish the best. I think he saw a world of aristocracy where the king flourished, the prince flourished, some of the dukes had a pretty good time, but everybody else was out in the field being thrashed, you know? And if you could create a country where everybody had some chance to flourish and to be happy, that would be all the better. But he knew it was going to be tough. He knew that on some level we are extremely fascinated by figures of authority, fascinated to the point of fixation, hypnotism. You know what I mean? If you read a lot of the work of Mark Twain, you'll see he's a little younger than Whitman. He's roughly his contemporary. And Twain is utterly fascinated with aristocracy. You know, he can't tell and retell the story about, the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. He does an entire book about St. Joan, which I read to my son when he was 7 years old. And they're mostly the transcripts of St. Joan from her trial. But he's very deeply into that, and you see all the stuff about the king and the duke in Huckleberry Finn, the Prince and the Pauper, another one where he goes back to merry old England, and he's always slamming the life out of aristocracy, and American democracy is always winning. But he also loves aristocracy because he believes it's always going to rise again, and he's always going to have a job giving it a good thrashing and making everybody laugh. But then it'll be back. You know, hearing Huck Finn talk about the kings and the dukes and what they're like is some of the best comic material you'd ever imagine. Walt would never talk comically about kings and dukes because they're so damn dangerous, you know. But I don't think Twain could imagine a world where they were gone. You know, Twain would be having the time of his life now. You know, writing about the contemporary White House. He would just be out of his mind with joy, right? Here they are. Well, let's write them out of existence. No, they're here. Let's write about them. You know? So two very different takes, it seems to me. And Twain was an admirer of Whitman. He went to one of his Lincoln presentations, which he used at the end of his life. Did at the end of his life in order to support himself. He gave money to Whitman, but he probably thought Whitman a very unworldly man as compared to him, because he too so fascinated by feudalism, so fascinated by kings and queens and their context and how they exist in the American context. Whitman's fascination with them involves paying as little attention to them as you possibly can. It's a form of fascination in this case. Anybody else? One more and then off into the blessed night. All right. Yes. Please.
Personal question about your own work.
Sure.
Okay. So I'm in Mr. Hall's class. I was in it freshman year and I'm in it now senior year. And we read a lot of your books and like a lot of your stuff.
Yes, you guys are responsible for my making a living. It's wonderful. Without you, no jacket, no shirt. Yeah.
And it's like a lot of your books, I noticed that you like the idea of like individual thoughts and individual, just like coming up with like your own like mindset about like how things are. So would like do you consider yourself a romantic or no?
It's a very good question. I mean, I guess we'd have to ask, what do you mean by a romantic, all right? And the extreme form, to me, of romanticism is embodied by Percy B. Shelley. And his watchword, it seems to me, the best illumination of Percy B. Shelley, is something that he said once, but he might have said it every day for all purposes. I go until I am stopped, and I never am stopped. Right? That meant that Percy B. Shelley would plunge into anything. Politics, friendship, poetry, love, and particularly love. He was a headlong person, and he would burn through people, burn through love, burn through poems, come out the other end, and then finds another poem to burn through, another person to love to burn through, and he would leave in his wake people who were not always pleased with him. But he wrote Prometheus Unbound. He wrote Ode to the West Wind. He wrote Queen Mab. So, am I like that? No, I've been married for 30 years. You know, I'm very admiring of Shelley, and I'm very admiring of that temperament, but I also do try to mention to students, and you see it manifest in rock and roll stars, at least in the past, all the time. You know, our friend Jim Morrison maybe had a little bit of that in him, and Grace Slick had a little bit of that, and Brian Jones, Rolling Stones, you know? Yes, Brian Jones had a little bit of that. They just burn it out, burn the candle, as the poet says, at both ends. And I'm not that guy. Do you know what I mean? Romantics never lived to be, I'm 67, romantics never lived to be 67, you know? It's just, it can't happen, right? It can't happen. Was Whitman a romantic? It's a good question. I think he was. I think he burned himself down in those hospitals, and then he got stroke after stroke. And you know that great line by Keith Richards, speaking of rock and roll? And Keith, of course, is giving the lie to all of us, a headlong, sort of romantic, ruffian figure, you know, who will presumably never die. I love those great posters, you know. We have to think carefully about the world we're going to leave to Keith Richards. But he has a great line. He says, he's talking about his adventures in the hip world of London. He says, in one of his songs, I wasn't looking too good, but I was feeling real well. Right? And Whitman is kind of the opposite, do you know? He was looking real good, but he wasn't feeling real well. You know, Walt, I have to admit to you, never saw a camera he didn't like. You know? And he got photographed all the time, and he was the archetypal beautiful old man. You ever see those pictures of Walt looking at the butterfly? He looks like a saint, and that's what he wanted to look like. You know? He was, in a way, he was advertising his work. He had a side, a commercial side, for sure. And yet he didn't feel well. He couldn't walk very well. He was, you know, he'd wake up with fevers and chills and sweats, and he tried to be good-humored about it all, but beginning in about 65 or 6, he lost his great good health, and the buffalo strength that had been with him for so long left. He burnt himself out. Now, you get a poet like Wordsworth, who is in his way of romantic, in his youth, right? He becomes more and more of a solid citizen, and in many ways a conservative, up to the point where he is willing to write a sequence of sonnets in behalf of capital punishment. I'm not glad I told you that, but it is true. And so that you're not a romantic anymore when you're writing about a sequence of sonnets in behalf of capital punishment, you know? So a lot of it has to do with the intensity of commitment to those things that you find that you want to idealize. And love is preeminent, it seems to me. You know, when you call somebody on the school bus a romantic, you mean that somebody who's in love with love. And that's a better understanding of romanticism than most romanticists have, in my opinion. You know, somebody who just overvalues, according to the sane people around, erotic life, right? To which Shelley says, what do you mean overvalues erotic life? It's the only thing. I'll die for it. And he dies in his 20s. Keats dies in his 20s, you know? So that's more answer than you maybe wanted. But the answer is, I admire them as they go by. I caution my students about them. And I try to learn from them both positively and negatively, more positively. Really. Yes?
Just a quick question. I was wondering, you know, when Whitman goes on, he enumerates like all these different people.
Yeah.
At the end of Song of Myself, I think that you went there. And it was very clear that you said that you wanted Americans to be able to see elements of themselves in each one of these people, all the way down to the slave girl and even the Tuckahoe I think you mentioned. But, you know, especially in the time of Whitman, Civil War, and obviously the Mexican-American War precipitated like the expansion of slavery.
It sure did, yeah.
It's like he's living through a time in American history that's expansionist, conquest, violent. it just seems to be that, I don't know how, it seems like violence is a very American thing in his world, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how he could divine that being kind of souls to the earth is like the right way for Americans to go, as opposed to trying to be cultivated in some sense
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah.
kind of shape their appetites. Because clearly, you know, I don't know, maybe the first generation after the founding generation perishes, they're not doing a good job, you know, or they're showing that democratic man is just an appetite versus this soulful,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to explain it. It seems like democratic man after the founding generation has proven to be much more about the appetite as opposed to
Mhm.
trying to see themselves reflected in their
Yes.
fellow man.
I think that Whitman would have agreed with many of the things that you're just saying. He didn't like those big bugs. He didn't like commercialism. He didn't like greed. He was sad about all those things, and he tried to be as articulate as he could about them. But he also did believe that in the best of America, and he counted the best of America often to be Westerners, Lincoln, farm boys, there was hope for a true democracy. But he wouldn't have denied anything that you're saying, right? His view of violence does seem to me problematic. One of the scenes of violence that he is involved with is in the Mexican-American War. And it does seem to be that that's a bit, he's endorsing implicitly an potentially imperialist agenda there. But when you think about Walt and his view of expansion of America, what he's thinking most of the time is the expansion of democracy and the opportunity for other people to live democratically. Now that may be naive on his part, but that is what he is thinking of, particularly in the poems. So it's a complex thing. It's also the fact that Whitman, when he is writing his journalism, is a much less radical figure than when he's writing his poems. When he's writing his journalism, he's measured in his contempt for slavery. When he's writing his poems, he's a beautiful celebrant of liberation for all people. So there's some tension there. As I say, I tend to like to look at poets at their best to see what it is they can teach us most immediately and for the future. And so I isolate parts of Whitman, the great poem, The Life in the Hospital, that seems to me inspiring. And I hope that the view is legitimate. Anything else? All right, thank you so much for coming.